I'm Precious Trisha Avoli. I work with Akina Mama Wa Afrika, a Pan African Feminist leadership organization. We have 3 thematic areas, that is sexual reproductive health and rights, women in political leadership, and economic justice and climate action. We are part of the VCA Alliance members, and we work in 3 regions, that is Kenya, Tunisia, and Zambia. And our main role in the Alliance is to bring in a Pan African feminist perspective to climate justice. How we approach climate justice as an organization is we stem from the fact that the climate crisis was heavily brought on by the economic crisis. And to solve the climate crisis, then we have to deal with our economic crisis. And we move from the thesis that the current world order was heavily influenced by power structures or systems that have been here since time memorial, really, that then make the shift between the power between the global north and the global south. And some of these structures include the neoliberalism, neocapitalism, patriarchy, and all the other isms that really shape a lot of our structure in power. So for us then, as Akina Mama, our belief is that for us to solve the climate crisis, we have to deal with the root cause. And to deal with the root cause, then we have to address the issue of the economic crisis. We have been part of the Alliance since 2021. And in VCA Kenya, we have 4 partners, that is Lamu Women Alliance. We have Siaya Muungano Network, Crown Trust, and Women Empowerment Link. And together with our partners, our main role in Kenya is to deal with gender and climate justice. Because as part of our beliefs and as being Pan-African feminists, we do believe that women and other marginalized groups bear the biggest brunt of the climate crisis when disasters happen, when a lot of the effects that come with the climate crisis, but have never been really at the decision-making table or are never really part of the cause of what led us here in the first place. So for us to acknowledge what led us here in the first place, we believe that if we are going to make any power shift or any shift in solving the climate crisis, then we need to hold accountable the people that led us here in the first place. And why we do believe that the economic crisis led us here is really looking back. Being African is to always believe in the Sankofa, which really symbolizes looking back. And in looking back, we would go as far as the industrial era, which was in the 1945, when industrialization was coming up, but also a critical time when agencies like the UN, agencies like the IMF, the World Bank were really being put in place to revive economies of the global north that were taking part in the war. And at this particular time, just to draw our attention is to really recognize that Africa was really not part of this. But in the way all this was being championed is that Africa was then looked at the consumer for whatever industries were being constructed. And fast forward to 1970, when the first industrial climate crisis then began, this was really heavily the plastic crisis, is that we see a lot of fault coming in on how the women in global south are really contributing to the crisis by the idea of having firewood for cooking or cutting down trees for firewood and etc really. But also to look at the fact that because of the economic crisis and really in order to revive economies, global north countries had to do a lot of power struggles in terms of extracting African resources to rebuild their economies. And extraction is also one of the biggest problems in the climate crisis, or a leading cause in the climate crisis. Take, for example, what's happening in Congo, what's happening in Sudan, and what's happening really all over the continent is really just something to look at in terms of where we are in the climate crisis. So our belief really is because of this important and unique history that Africa really holds, but together as the global south, is to acknowledge that we cannot solve the crisis if there still exist issues of unequal power balance or unequal, if we are never invited to the decision-making table. And even when invited to the decision-making table, then we need to critically look at whose voice is being represented at the decision-making table. So for us as Akina Mama Wa Afrika, we do believe that if women and youth and other marginalized groups are bearing the biggest brunt of the crisis, then they need to be seated at the decision-making table. But it is not enough to just do women participation of saying there were 2 women in the room or 4 women in the room, but to go beyond that, to make sure that the women in the room are actually pushing for solutions that are bringing in their reality, but also Africa's reality as a whole, but to always remember the background of what led us here in the first place. So as Akina Mama Wa Afrika, we do hold an Africa Women Leadership Institute every year that hosts over 25 young women. And these women really are taken through a training or an experience on leadership, just to look at what their role in the climate crisis could be and what their role could be at the front line of fighting the climate crisis, but also getting solutions to the climate crisis. The Institute begins with a module on personal development, because as feminists, we do believe that the person is political. And for us to critically look at issues, then we need to make our own bodies, thought, and mind at ease, but also to make them well. And with that, then we deal with the feminist theory and as well as gender and the climate crisis. So our approach also includes knowledge production. We have produced a lot of knowledge on, for example, the Feminist Climate Guide. We have also produced several books and articles and writings on economic justice and climate action. Fully. Most of our economic justice and climate action work is quite new, but it has taken shape based on the angle at which we approach the climate crisis. And some of the things that we do believe will help us solve the climate crisis is to deal with the issue of debt for nature swap. And by debt for nature swap, what we mean is Africa needs money that is not in form of loans for us to fight the crisis. We cannot fight the crisis if we are constantly believing in profit over people or profit over nature, which in turn is really just climate coloniality, because every time we get funds to fight the crisis, if we are saying this is a global crisis and we are holding the perpetrator, the polluter must pay principle, which really was in the Kyoto Protocol, but overturned by the Paris Agreement, then we need to really hold the polluter. We need to go back to the Kyoto Protocol principles of holding the polluter accountable. The polluter must pay for what they are doing to the crisis, and they need to pay their fair share of that. And in return, Africa also needs to get money that is reparations, just for what happened to her, but what continues to happen to her. Even just looking at the existing treaties that came before our gaining of independence, with like the Energy Charter Treaty, which really is a form of treaty where we have to constantly comply with strict things that come really with the money that is given to us through climate financing. And for that, the nearest example is really that the carbon trading that, was introduced by the Paris Agreement under the facade of the involuntary and voluntary agreement. But in essence, what this is trying to promote is really climate coloniality of you give me money and I sell off my environment. But the question truly is, to what extent must this be? So in solving all our solutions, in coming up with climate solutions, we need to look at the long run and never to deal with the cosmetic solutions in solving the climate crisis. Because constantly dealing with cosmetic solutions will always lead us where we are, will always lead us back to where we are from. Because if we are saying, for example, that to solve the issue of drought or to solve the issue of heat, then you might as well just tell people to plant trees, but also it goes down to what kind of trees are you planting. If you're telling people plant eucalyptus or pine trees, which constantly suck up the water nutrients and soil nutrients and really water from the soil, then we are not solving anything from the crisis, but really just being part of the problem. So how we then approach the crisis is you have to deal with the root cause, the rotten in the system. You have to acknowledge all the isms and all the systematic issues that continue to perpetrate or to motivate the crisis to exist for us to actually make a step further. So when making negotiations that affect Africa, we need Africa on the table, not just its leaders, but the voices of the people that are affected by the climate crisis. Because when floods affect African countries, the people who take the boats are not the people that are going to step back and be washed away by the floods. The people that have the money are quickly going to take away are going to simply take a big boat and go to the shore where there's no flood. So for us to then solve the crisis, we need to come from a sort of a bottom-up approach, forgive my language on that, but for us to come from a bottom-up approach where we center voices of the marginalized groups and minoritized groups and gender-expansive persons when dealing with the climate crisis, for us to actually come up with a better solution and not solutions that just smear the surface of the road with just black but not tarmac down. So what we really need to do is to hold the polluter accountable for what they continue to do on the Africa continent. We need to address the issue of extractives. We need to address the issue of consumerism, the issue of capitalism, the issue of neocolonialism that keeps on shaping all our climate governance structures. Because if we are being told that the carbon finance markets and trading is supposed to influence climate financing, then that is a problem that we have to constantly deal with. And also look at when that decision was being made, how many African countries were in the room, but also how many African women, youth, and other minoritized groups were in that room. So in brief, and to conclude, is that as Akina Mama Wa Afrika, we deal that the climate crisis can only be dealt from the bottom, from addressing what the root is in the system, from addressing systematic issues that continue to hold. We need to bridge the gap between the unequal power that exists between the global north and the global south.